think just in the interest of our technology, perhaps I'll call your name and you'll say yes, and Danny will help me keep track of who says yes. So Sean Along.
I see Sean, he's here.
Great. Mujib Chaudhry, I see Mujib, there
Yep.
he is. Ben Geffen.
I saw Ben come in, yep.
Great, thank you. Bilal Qayyum, I see Bilal. Michael Ramming.
I do not see Michael.
Okay. Michael Wehrman, I see Michael. And Sarah Young, I see Sarah. Very good. Thank you all. Anthony, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself? Oh my goodness.
Oh, you forgot George.
Mr. Mosey, how did that happen? Forgive me, forgive me. All right. And our parliamentarian, so you know that's really like a double disgrace to miss him. So forgive me. Have I captured all of the other commissioners?
I believe that is the case.
Okay, thank you. So Anthony, once again, will you please introduce yourself and your staff?
Sure. My name's Anthony Arachi. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Police Advisory Commission. With us tonight is Miss Angelica Hendricks. Give a little wave. Who else do we have? Let's see if I can see. Janine Zajac. You can give us a wave. Talia Grimmage. I don't see her, but I'm sure she's here in spirit if she's not signed on yet. Angelica, I already said you. Anastasia McCarthy, who I'm not sure is here or not.
She's not here.
No, and we have the MC of the evening, Danny, who always keeps everything running smoothly.
Just while on me, I just recently put the agenda in the chat, but I'll do it again. And if you have questions, feel free to send them in the chat. And we can also unmute people when we get to question answer section if people have questions.
Thank you. So we have some exciting news since we met in January, which is that Councilmember Curtis Jones's office has introduced the long-awaited Civilian Police Oversight Commission legislation. You know, we are grateful to Councilmember Jones and Council President Clark for putting together this legislation and listening to the clear voices from Philadelphia that we needed greater and more efficient police reform in the city. As we know, in November, this was a ballot question. Philadelphians overwhelmingly voted in support of enhanced reform, and so we're lucky to have that. We're also lucky to have with us this evening Samantha Williams from Councilmember Jones's office to walk through the legislation. But I want to just make a comment about that before we turn it over to Samantha, is that this legislation looks great, and we're very, very pleased. You know, this is kind of, they have planned for Philadelphia, you know, 4 gold star police oversight. It looks, they happily have incorporated some of the suggestions from Anthony and our previous executive director, Hans. And so we couldn't be happier with the ordinance itself. It gives greater authority for investigations. It gives the authority for the Civilian Oversight Board to make disciplinary recommendations. It provides access to information that this commission has never had in terms of police department information. So it's all good, right? Well, it's all good if the funding comes with it to support it. And so I want to encourage you all to, of course, listen closely to Samantha, but also to participate in the process. I believe that Councilmember Jones's office will be calling for a hearing on this. I know that I'm sure that Samantha will tell us more about it. But remember, we got this far with the voices of the people, but we can't kind of go the distance I'm never really great on my sports metaphors, so you'll forgive me, but we can't get to the finish line unless there's sufficient funding to support this well-needed, highly needed program in Philadelphia. So with that, I'll turn it over to Samantha Williams. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Hi, Rhonda. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. And hello to everyone on the call. I see Dee Duke over there clapping. I miss you, Dee. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Samantha Williams. I'm the Director of Legislation and Policy for Councilmember Jones, and I coordinate City Council's Public Safety Committees and the Criminal Justice Committee and the Legislative Oversight Committee. So as a part of my responsibilities, working with Councilmember Jones was to create a proposal for the Citizens Police Oversight Commission. As Rhonda stated, this was a ballot question that over 500,000 Philadelphians voted yes for and are very excited for. And it took us months of research and preparation to get to the point to introduce a proposal, which we believe is, the first step in moving forward with creating the new commission. I want to briefly go through some slides. The legislation is about 30 pages long, and there's a lot to take in there, but I'm going to try my best to only use 20 minutes of your time, maybe less, so that I can also answer some questions, and I know you have other important presentations tonight as well. So I wanted to briefly talk about the composition of the commission, or the proposed composition of the commission. It's our proposal that the new commission have 9 voting members and that the appointment process would kind of flow in 3 steps. Instead of direct appointments, we would propose the appointment of a selection panel who could then field applications from members of the public who are interested in serving on the commission. We would like that applicants be adult residents of the city of Philadelphia, have independence from the mayor and council, and have qualifications that are relevant to criminal justice and public safety and the improvement of law enforcement, and also demonstrated commitment to our citizens. We would then, after the selection process, propose that the selection panel nominate 9 individuals who will then be confirmed by city council in a confirmation hearing. As you're aware, it's similar to the process that happens with the Board of Education, or even the recent confirmation hearing of City Solicitor Cortez, who is on the line tonight, that there is work done in the process before it gets to that point, but that council will confirm these members, or not confirm these members. We can go to the next slide. Some other important things to note, that initial appointment terms would be staggered with regular appointment terms of 4 years and a term limit of 2 consecutive terms. We would like the members to undergo training related to law enforcement and constitutional law, so that they are aware of not only some of the things they will be seeing in complaints, but what officers are doing on the ground. Members under our proposal would be prohibited from seeking a public elected office while they are members of commission, or making any financial contributions as a way to aid to transparency, or not have members of the commission use it solely for political purposes. And we do want to compensate the commissioners for official business on the commission. We can go to the next slide. So just briefly, as the PAC already has, there will be an executive director, but we also propose that there be chief legal counsel who can handle any relevant legal matters that the commission needs, as well as providing for the ability to hire any consultants for any business that their own staff is unable to handle. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the crux of the legislation really comes in the proposed powers and duties of the legislation. We heard a lot from the community. We heard a lot from advocacy groups. We heard a lot from law enforcement agencies and civil rights agencies and attorneys and researchers about best practices and also what people wanted to see. And what people really wanted to see was the ability for the commission to investigate complaints, the ability for the commission to have access to the evidence they need to investigate complaints, and also more transparency in terms of what data is being made available to the public after complaints are received and investigations are ongoing or completed. So under our proposal, the commission would receive, register, and investigate all citizens' complaints made against officers of the police department. But there would also be the ability for members of the police department under certain circumstances to also make complaints with the commission in circumstances where they might feel as though the regular channels within their own department, they would not feel comfortable making the complaint in that arena. That would be for instances of complaints alleging physical abuse, domestic violence, lying, bribery, corruption, intimidation, harassment, or other complaints that may arise that affect the integrity of the criminal justice process. Then we also explored what types of complaints the commission may want to, in its discretion, investigate even when no complaint is filed. In that area, we have provided the power for the commission to investigate issues relating to improper search and seizure, use of force when officers are using weapons, anytime an officer discharges a firearm, any interaction that occurs in police custody or results from police action that involves an injury, and it could be any injury, but including also death and serious bodily injury, and any misconduct that might develop during the investigation of another officer. Additionally, we propose that the commission not be only investigatory based, but also do certain reviews and audits. So we want the commission to have the ability to investigate and do data analysis and audits related to practices and policies of the police department, which I will also talk about a little bit more later. But we want them to have the ability to review lawsuits or claims against the department in case they need to reopen investigations or launch new investigations. We want them to have the ability to review certain internal affairs files for the purposes of launching an investigation or reopening an investigation. We want there to be a performance audit of the executive director and the commissioner, an annual review of the police budget, and the commission under the current proposal would have the ability to hold a vote of no confidence in the police commissioner. So another really important thing is access. So with the responsibility of investigating complaints needs to come the ability to have readily available access to evidence and interviews and statements and anything the commission would need to be able to thoroughly investigate a complaint and come to a finding on a complaint. Under this proposal, we would propose that the commission would have the same access to crime scenes, witnesses, officer interviews, files and records of the department, as well as access to city agencies when databases when related to investigations. And we can go to the next slide. As a part of the commission's duties, we propose that when a complaint is investigated and the commission finds that the claims are substantiated, that they be able to recommend charges be brought against an officer. The police commissioner would have to respond in writing to that recommendation and provide a response as to whether the commissioner intends to implement the recommended discipline, whether the commissioner intends to not recommend that discipline, and why. This adds to the purpose of transparency because we're now having, the recommendation made, and if we're finding that every time the commissioner makes the commission makes a recommendation to the commissioner and the commissioner declines to implement that recommendation, then there might be a problem there. Obviously, the ability to discipline officers is still upon the commissioner, but the commissioner would not be able to render a final disciplinary decision until the commission was complete with their investigation and submitted their findings and recommendations. The legislation also provides the ability for the chair of public safety to hold public hearings regarding any disciplinary recommendations or decisions. So in hand with the disciplinary recommendations, the commission would also have the ability to make policy recommendations. In a similar fashion, we would propose that the police commissioner do a detailed response about whether or not the policy recommendation would be implemented. And in similar fashion, the chair of public safety could hold public hearings to warrant a public explanation for any policy recommendations or decisions. In addition to those responsibilities, we would obviously propose that the commission held meetings, but that they also did public hearings on the police department's policies and procedures and practices and the police department's budget. I think this is a good way for the commission to further interact with the public and this be a public engagement experience and an educational experience for the public. Obviously, when we're going through the budget process, there's not a whole lot of public engagement in that process, in my opinion. And there's not a whole lot of explanation to the public about the things that are going into the budget. And we believe this is the ultimate way to add more transparency to that process. And then we would also propose that the commission participate in the police board of inquiry hearings in the actual charging and the actual administrative prosecution of the complaints that they have put forward to find as substantiated. We would require the commission to do reporting, particularly on aggregate data of the complaints they are receiving and investigating. We thought that was important, as well as having them uploaded into some sort of database or on a website so that the public can also understand the work of the commission, how many complaints are coming in, what are those types of complaints, what are the outcomes of those complaints. And we can go to the next slide. We also would propose, I think I already went over this, but that certain investigatory information be posted to the commission's website, certain reports, and even certain evidence such as video evidence be posted to the website as long as the victim who was filing the complaint was okay with that. We'd also propose that other agencies be required to provide certain reports to the commission, and that would be the commissioner, the city solicitor, and the Department of Labor. And we'd also allow the city controller to do performance and financial audits of the commission. And lastly, there is a penalty section within the legislation that would essentially make it a violation of the law for any city employee or agency or officer to fail to cooperate in an investigation or relay false information during an investigation of the commission. We would also allow, in terms of an officer, that the commission can bring a charge of refusal to cooperate to the police commissioner with a recommendation of discipline. And I think that is my last slide, and I got through that very quickly as promised, just to be able to have time for some questions before we move into the next presentation.
We already have a question from the chat, Samantha. Someone asked, they said, this sounds expensive. What has been committed in terms of funding to the CPOC?
So we're still working on the funding portion of the proposal. It was important to get onto paper what we wanted to see and what our goals were. We are obviously aware that we're not in the best financial situation as a city. So we're having those discussions now. We have not reached an agreement in terms of numbers, but we are having those discussions now.
Does anyone else have questions?
Danny, there was a question from Marnie Kerr.
Great, I am unmuting you, Marnie. Folks, if you have questions, also feel free to send them in the chat or use the raise your hand feature. Marnie, I'm unmuting you. Oop, it looks like you have to click the unmute button. There we go.
I have two questions, actually. The first is that if the commission meets every 2 months, I don't see how it can possibly accomplish all the things that you've laid out here, which are wonderful. They're wonderful, but every 2 months sounds as if they are volunteers. And the research that I've done in other cities where the commission, whatever it is meets only a few times and they're volunteer, it's totally doesn't work. And my other question is, this all sounds wonderful, except how about Act 111? Is there a plan to go after the state to make it possible to put this commission into effect?
Thank you for the questions, Marnie. To answer your first question, in terms of the commission's meetings, with the language bi-monthly, we met twice a month, not every other month. So we would hope that the commission could meet twice a month, but we would also, want to know from the current commissioners of the PAC if twice a month is something that's feasible, is twice a month not enough. So we're definitely flexible with that language, but we did meet twice a month with that language. In terms of Act 111, there's currently some movement at the state level with Act 111. We designed our proposal in mind with our state constraints, and we look forward to additional change and the ability to go even further in the future, but our proposal was in mind with our current state law constraints.
And if I
In
can
line
jump
with Act 111?
Yes, we believe so.
And if I
We
can jump
believe
in,
that we,
if I can jump in for one thing for what the regarding what the commission will do, there will also be a professional staff working every day. So when the commission meets, like the commissioners are not going to investigate use of force. The commissioners are not going to audit individual cases. They're going to be like sort of, the captains of the ship, and you'll have a professional staff that'll be doing all of this work in real time.
Okay. Sounds much better.
yes, and I'm sorry if I glazed over that part, but yes, there will be, it will be fully staffed, and we hope that there would be lots of investigators and researchers, but we're still working on all that. And Anthony has been actively helping me with seeing what that could look like in terms of numbers of staff and budgetary issues.
As a follow-up question on the budget question, someone, they asked, can they still tie the funding to the portion of the police department's budget like other cities do?
That is definitely an option and definitely something that is being discussed. But there is a variety of proposals that are being discussed right now. But yes, that is an option, and it's not too late to explore really any, budgetary structure.
Another question we had is, who exactly will make the decision on this proposal?
So the entire city council will make the decision on this proposal. This proposal was sent to the committee of the whole, which all 17 council members are a part of. We are looking forward to having individual discussions with members. Their initial feedback was good. But as we know, with legislation, especially legislation that's this comprehensive, that there will be a extensive amendment process potentially. So we look forward to having discussions with all of the members about any of their questions or concerns or what they want to see or any changes or anything they have interest in moving forward. But it will be the decision of all 17 members.
Great. Another question we had, Samantha, is how does CPOC investigation authority exist with respect to internal affairs? Is it concurrent with internal affairs, or must CPOC wait until after internal affairs investigation is complete? If findings are contradictory, who supersedes who?
That's a great question. So under this proposal as it stands, we would propose that all citizens' complaints go to the commission. There's obviously going to be other types of complaints that internal affairs are going to investigate, but under this proposal, all citizens' complaints will go to the commission. The internal affairs would have other complaints that they would be investigating. If there was a scenario where both entities had the authority to investigate a complaint, then it would be a concurrent investigation. I wouldn't necessarily say that internal affairs, if there was a concurrent investigation, would supersede that investigation. But I think that would obviously be a case-by-case determination. But we would like to see the commission have the authority to be investigating the citizens' complaints.
Someone asked, is there a minimum level of staffing at the commission?
That is not something that I would be writing into the legislation, and not something that I would necessarily determine. So I don't know the answer to that question.
Another funding question was, if the funding doesn't come through, what gets cut from these responsibilities, since they can't do everything if they don't have enough money?
That is something that we're also in discussions about and working through. I would hope that if we were under particular constraints with this budget cycle, that we could do maybe a phased in rollout, and so that it wouldn't be everything coming together at the same time, but that we could ramp up to the full duties and responsibilities of the commission. But that is certainly going to be a consideration when we go over finances.
Gail asked, will any charter changes be needed at this point?
Not at this point.
And is there allowance for returning citizens to be part of the Board of Commission?
I don't see why not. I don't believe there would be any prohibitions in the legislation as it stands.
Those are all the questions I have in the chat right now. Does anybody else have any other? Oh, I just got one. Will PAC attorney report to the law department?
No. So this is an independent body. So the commission could choose to consult the law department if they wanted to, but decisions of the law department would not be binding upon them. And the commission would also have their own chief counsel that they could seek legal advice from.
Michael, I'm going to mute you for your question.
Great. Thank you, Danny. And thank you, Samantha, for providing a lot of information, well organized in a pretty concise time frame. I appreciate that. I'm curious if I'm still forming my question in my head. There's thought given to how you define when whether the police department or an individual officer is not compliant. And I believe you used a different term. That one of the things that I've seen in the years with the PAC is that whether it's the police or an individual officer, they're able to slow walk data requests where it's not clearly an outright denial, but there's so little plausible deniability remaining in terms of complying with the request that it feels like a fool's errand to try to continue, even when their participation is compelled. And certainly in the case of, I'm trying to think of a specific example where we were looking to get testimony from an officer who was not compelled to comply because they were on leave for such a period of time, that there seemed to be a good number of loopholes and experientially enough circumstances where the police seem pretty well versed in what those loopholes are so as to avoid complying with the authority that we have granted. So I don't want to say I'm delighted to see punishment. I'm certainly not delighted to see punishment, but some degree of I'm looking for a very obvious word at this point, but I'm excited to see ramifications for non-compliance. But do you have measurements or ways of determining, say, the difference between denial and slow walking to enforce those? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And that's a valid concern. We would hope that the police department and the administration sees this as a mandate from the citizens of Philadelphia, that they want cooperation in investigations, they want transparency in investigations and the complaint process. I'm not sure how to necessarily answer that question, as it seems to be on a case-by-case basis, whether the department or an individual officer would try to slow walk something or evade the process. I do think that the addition of a chief counsel to the commission would be very important if the commission needed to take additional action to compel information. I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry, I'm I'm trying my best, but I'm just not sure how it's all going to work at this moment. Okay. But I do think that them having their own counsel who could represent them in legal situations or take certain things to the court would be helpful.
Great, thank you.
Someone asked, sorry, going back. The legislation mentions background checks for commissioners. What results in a background check would rule a candidate out?
I don't have an answer for that question.
Okay.
I don't think that's necessarily been decided on at this moment.
Great. Sean, you had a question. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Miss Samantha.
Hey, Sean.
I want to know, do you think that the commission can get subpoena power to make sure that all officers do all part, and just in case, just like my fellow commissioner say, Michael, just in case they try to. So what? Is there any way that we could get like almost like subpoena power, almost like the courts?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm sorry if I passed over that in my presentation, but there is language providing the commission with subpoena power in the legislation.
I just want to be clear that the PAC currently has subpoena power, but that implementing that without all of the other protections in the ordinance has made it difficult. And I think that speaks to Michael's question, like, how do you measure when you take that next step? You know, how do you decide when an officer or an entity is actually just not complying? And I think they end up being factual determinations. But I'm eager to see how, because we're, putting Samantha on the hot seat, how she develops this as it goes forward.
No, and I agree. I think it's a very important point of discussion. As I was saying when responding to Michael's question, I do think having their own attorney would be helpful. I know now the current process and I love the attorneys at the law department, especially the new city solicitor. But obviously there are sometimes inherent conflicts that come about when your legal representation is the legal representation of another agency that you might be trying to take an adverse action against. Why I was playing up the chief counsel so much is that this is an independent attorney who's really going to be able to be looking over those scenarios on a case-by-case basis and trying to determine the best legal course for the commission, and then be able to actually carry that out for them.
Samantha, I apologize. So we actually have our own legal counsel, but it's not in the way that it's envisioned in the ordinance, right? It's a contract position. And so the relationship is different from what you're envisioning for the future. I just wanted to make sure that everyone is clear and that our counsel, Bibi Kivitz, is joining us this evening. And I don't want her to think she got fired all of a sudden. So
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
Thank you.
Another question we have is, what is the timeline for all of this? Like the legislation process, as well as the budgeting and the staffing?
So it's our office's personal goal to get this legislation passed before the implementation of the new budget. So we would hope that we would be having hearings on the legislation in April. That we would use the month of March to continue discussions with advocates, with interested parties, to make any necessary changes before a hearing. And then we also anticipate, because of the level of public interest in the legislation, that this might have to be done in multiple hearings and not one, because we anticipate there will be a large public participation in the comment process. And then once we get through that hearing process, then we would hope that it could be voted on by June. And that would provide really the summertime to work on some of the necessary steps that would be needed to be implemented, like the solicitation of applications, the nomination of commissioners, the hiring of staff, even securing maybe additional office space, different office space. I don't know if we'll be in office spaces come the fall due to the pandemic. But yes, we would hope in terms of the actual legislation that it would be voted on by June, and that the implementation process takes place shortly thereafter.
Bilal, you were my next hand raised. I'm unmuting you.
Samantha, first of all, I want to commend you for the wonderful job that you have done to this point. I don't know if everybody on this Zoom knows that you started this effort from zero and brought us to the point we are now. So I personally want to commend you for the wonderful job you've done. And I will let the councilman know he needs to give you a raise.
Oh, thank you. That's always appreciated.
But in all seriousness, with the proposal, and where we are now and where we hope to be in the future, I really believe that the money issues got to be a serious discussion. And I agree with you some about phasing in, but I think that you should lobby for at least starting off as a $3 million bottom line, and then move up as we go on. Because if we don't have the proper money to do this, it's just legislation without any teeth. We got to have the proper funding to make this work. And you mentioned that over 500,000 people voted for this. So it was a substantial vote for the citizens of the city to support this new commission. So it won't mean anything if we don't have the proper funding. So I think that we need to have a basement amount, and I'm suggesting 3 million. It could be higher. And then as we move along and get staff and action, then the money, like you suggested, could be phased in.
I absolutely agree with you. Councilman always says, you can tell about what city council cares about by how much money they give it. And I think that, this is a circumstance where the public has told us that they really want something, and we need to make sure that there's enough money available for the commission to actually do all the things that we're asking them to do in this legislation and do it well and not be stressed and not be hampered and not have roadblocks in their way. So I totally agree with you. I want to thank Anthony. Anthony's helping me out right now with working through some things so that I can better understand how much individual staffing costs as well as departments could potentially cost. We do have a meeting set up next week with the administration to discuss our budgetary concerns and requests. And it is our goal to work this out hopefully before the budgetary process begins. So the mayor's address is slated to be April 15th. I hope that we have worked that out by then. If we have to do a phased-in approach, I still think it needs to be a well-funded phased-in approach. If we have to take that route, we have to take that route. But I agree that there's no way that what we propose will work without adequate funding.
Danny, are there any other questions I want to?
I think Kisu, did you have a question? I'm unmuting you. I saw your hand raised earlier.
Yes, thank you for taking my call, and good evening to everyone. And my concern was the complaints against the officers. Would that include derelict of duty? Like that was the main thrust of my question. Would it, you know, if we're not getting the police service, or why could we have that investigated?
So as of right now, the proposal allows the commission to investigate any complaint they receive. So I think that there's a strong possibility that those circumstances could be investigated if the commission found that the claims alleged in the complaint were substantiated. But that would be a determination for the commission to make, that they are going to be receiving the complaint.
Well, I think those were all of our last questions that I had in the chat, and it looks like all the hands I saw raised.
Thank you. Samantha, I want to thank you for your presentation. You have distilled down the almost 30 pages of legislation into understandable bite-sized bits. I want to share the praise from Bilal. I mean, you and Councilmember Jones have taken on this often thankless task of police oversight. I think the thing we know about police oversight is that mostly everyone's always going to be irritated, which is okay, because for some people you're not doing enough, and for other people you're doing too much. But we all know it's vital and long overdue in Philadelphia. So thank you again for your willingness to present, to take these questions. And I'm going to assume this wasn't a time-sensitive offer on your part to take questions, and that folks can reach out to you at Councilmember Jones's office if they have additional questions.
Oh, absolutely. Please do. We are very interested to receive feedback on the legislation. So I know we have a meeting with Gail in maybe a week or two. I've been meeting with Anthony. I've been meeting with other people on this call. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns, suggestions. We will take them. We want this to be the best that it can be because Philadelphians deserve it. So I will, or maybe Danny, if you could share my email in the chat.
Can I?
Okay.
No, I'm going to do that right now.
Yes, please. So please feel free to email me and reach out to me. And thank you for having me today. And thank you to everyone on this call who has helped us through this process. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Samantha. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.
Bye. So Anthony, is the plan, do you want to do your brief update and then we'll turn to Angelica for her presentation?
Sure. Our update is incredibly brief. So the only thing that I wanted to add is that the police community mediation program. The letter to adjust the executive order to allow that process to pilot was sent today, and we already received a positive response from the mayor. They're going to write it up and give us the go-ahead to stand it up. So we'll be able to engage in that program and hopefully stand it up, and hopefully it's a great success. And
Exciting.
now we can go to Angelica, who has a great presentation for all of us.
Thanks so much
Um,
for that great
before-
introduction.
Before we begin, I'm just letting everyone know what Angelica's presenting on is I just put in the chat. So if you want to check out this report that Angelica did an amazing job on, you can grab that from our website. The link is in the chat.
Thank you so much, Danny. And thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Angelica Hendricks. I'm a policy analyst with the Police Advisory Commission. And during this presentation, I will discuss the PAC's review of pedestrian investigation policies within the Philadelphia Police Department. So I know just recently there was a Homeward Charter Amendment that just spoke of stop and frisk. And we hear about stop and frisk nationally, not just within the city, but also it's a national issue as well. And so what the PAC did was we identified all of the relevant police directives that relates to police officers interacting with the public. And we compared those directives with existing legal standards to determine if they are in fact compliant with existing legal standards. So these slides will show different areas that we reviewed, recommendations that we made, and what the Philadelphia Police Department's response was to each of those recommendations. Danny, could you hit the next slide, please?
Yep.
Thank you. So this report is divided among the 4 levels of how the police can interact with residents. And I will go over each in more detail during this presentation. But just for the background, those levels are referenced here. I have them 1 through 4. The least intrusive level of an interaction with an officer is what courts have defined as a mere encounter. The next is a stop, which requires officers to have a reasonable suspicion that a resident is engaged in criminal activity. And the third level is a frisk, and this requires officers to have a reasonable suspicion that the person that they have just stopped is armed and dangerous. And the last level and the most intrusive level is the search and or arrest. And this level requires probable cause, which is a standard that's higher than reasonable suspicion that the person committed a crime. So in the first stage of our report, we focused on the mere encounters, which I have highlighted as 1. So mere encounters are typically referred to as a consensual encounter between police and a resident. So an example of this could be an officer walking around the community and they approach someone and they ask the person if they have any knowledge about an incident that recently occurred. You know, if they have any information related to a shooting, a car theft, or anything. So during this interaction, the individual does not have to respond to police. They are free to simply walk away. So mere encounters are discussed in Philadelphia Police Department Directive 12.8, which we have here. Now for this report, I've reviewed their understanding of mere encounters to ensure these directives are compliant with existing legal standards. So the Philadelphia Police Department personnel are trained using these standards. So currently, as it relates to mere encounters, they are instructed that mere encounters are a consensual interaction where the officer may ask citizens questions and generally engage the citizen in conversation. And in this interaction, the police officer may ask for the identification of the person, but the citizen is under no obligation to engage the officer or actually provide that identification. And police officers are instructed that if a person does not comply, that does not mean that they can stop them, all right? Additionally, officers are instructed not to record or document when they are having these mere encounters. So the PAC believes that most of what is described here is correct. Legally, a resident can elect not to speak to officers and simply walk away. And legally, an officer can request an identification, but someone can also refuse that request. However, there's a recent case that required us to ask PPD to amend their directives. Danny, if you can hit the next slide. So a year ago, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania decided the case of Commonwealth versus Cost, which held that an officer's retention of an individual's identification card to conduct a warrant check was sufficient to signify to a person that they were not free to leave, such that the person was detained. So this case is specifically important because it speaks directly to the actions of Philadelphia police officers. So in this case, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court grappled with the question, would a person feel free to ignore the police and proceed about their business while the person is being questioned by a police officer who was holding their identification? So in this case, in April of 2017, a man named Harold Cost was in an alleyway in Philadelphia with a few other individuals when two Philadelphia police officers approached the group. The officers asked all of the individuals if they lived in the area, and they all replied no. So it was at that time, the officers asked for everyone's identification, and everyone complied with that request. But while holding the identification of the individuals, the police officers started asking questions. Questions such as, do you have anything on you that I need to know about? Is there anything in your bag that I need to know about? So at that time, Mr. Cost stated that he had a gun on his possession. And in court, the officer stated that he did not restrict Mr. Cost's movement in any way, nor did he preclude him from leaving the area. The officer stated he was free to leave up until that point where he stated he had a firearm. Annie, can you hit the next slide? So the court found that this was a case of a first impression, which means that they were dealing with an issue that they don't typically deal with. And it stated that, that they agreed with the defendant in this case, that the retention by a police officer of an identification card to conduct a warrant check will generally be a material and substantial escalating factor within the totality assessment that the court uses to determine if someone has been detained or not. So what the court actually found helpful was legal standards all over the country, specifically in the District of Columbia. So I would just read a portion of that case for individuals who may not be able to see their screen right now or may have difficulty reading the screen. So it states here, an officer's decision to run a check for outstanding warrants can be a pivotal event in an otherwise consensual street encounter. It sends a strong signal to a reasonable person that the officer will not allow him to leave while the inquiry is in progress. The critical point here is that the warrant check is still underway, its results not yet known when the officer is asking additional questions. So Danny, can you go to the next slide? So due to this court case, the PAC made several recommendations to the Philadelphia Police Department. First, require reasonable suspicion to conduct a warrant search. The PAC is asking that if the police want to search someone's name for a warrant, that they have a reason to do so, not simply because they have the power and authority to run these name searches. The second was also require documentation of these interactions. Since these interactions are not recorded, we cannot audit or review how many of these encounters are happening. And most importantly, the people who were chosen for these mirror encounters. What do they look like? What's their race, sex, age, things like that. And third, the PAC would like an audit to be conducted to ensure that if someone's name is being run in a warrant check, is for a valid purpose. So ultimately, the Philadelphia Police Department denied all three of these recommendations. The Philadelphia Police Department does not interpret the Cost case like we do, and they believe the key factor here is how long the officer was holding the ID, not simply them asking for the ID and retaining it. Annie, can you go to the next slide? So we do have some next steps though. So even though the Philadelphia Police Department did not agree to these recommendations, we will continue to advocate for them. And the next steps are seeking interpretations from other legal experts regarding Cost case. And additionally, if you believe you had a mere encounter with an officer and you think a policy was violated, please contact them. Next slide, please. So the second level of interaction, so we've discussed the mere encounter. The second level is the stop. And so usually when people are discussing stop and frisk, this is typically the first prong to that. A stop requires an officer to have reasonable suspicion that a resident is engaged in criminal activity to detain. Danny, can you go to the next slide? So PPD defines this detention as in Directive 12.8 as an interaction which is non-consensual in nature, where the officer has developed reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is occurring, and the subject is involved in criminal activity. The officer may demand identification from the citizen, and the citizen must comply at this point with those orders. So this is taken from Directive 12.8. Danny, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the PAC highlighted to the Philadelphia Police Department the 2019 holding of Commonwealth versus Hicks that changes what does reasonable suspicion actually mean. So in summary, Hicks held that officers cannot stop someone solely because they believe a person has a firearm on them, without anything else to conclude that a crime is happening. So this is impactful here because we know that there have been people stopped previously because an officer believed that they had a bulge on them and that bulge was consistent with that of a firearm, or maybe because someone called the police and stated that someone had a firearm on them. So Hicks tells the Philadelphia Police Department, as well as other law enforcement agencies, that they need more evidence to actually make that stop. So this right here is insufficient for the stop. Can you go to the next one, Danny? So another discussion surrounding officer stops is officers stopping individuals because they fit the description. And so the PAC reviewed existing policies related to these incidents. And that's Directive 5.16, which instructs officers to document the several factors that are related to these confrontations. So the directive is clear on what information to retrieve from the victim, what information to record in paperwork, and what information a supervisor will review. But if you look at this directive here, what's missing from the conversation is what happens when officers get it wrong. What happens when officers stop the wrong person? Can you go to the next slide, please? So we know this is an existing problem because in 2018, it was argued in federal court that Philadelphia police officers had continued to detain someone even when they knew the person was not involved in the crime that related to them fitting the description. So in that case, there was a flash, which is a call on the radio for someone involved in the crime. And the flash was for a Black male, 20 years old, 6'1", between 160 and 170 pounds, dark blue pants and a red hoodie. Moments later, officers saw Mr. Bay and stopped him. And Mr. Bay was 32 years old, 200 pounds, black sweatpants, red jacket. But upon turning around, the officers saw that Mr. Bay had a very long beard. But even though he did not fit the flash, there was no indication of facial hair or anything regarding facial identifications. The officer still stopped Mr. Bay, searched him, and arrested him. And he was not identified. The victim came to the scene and said this was not the person. Well, and he did not match the actual flash. So the federal court found that the officer should have known that Bay was not the person they were looking for, and they should have released him immediately upon discovering that. So unfortunately, the Philadelphia Police Department's directive did not contain specifically what is the process for releasing someone when they do not fit the flash. Danny, can you go to the next slide? So due to this, the PAC made several recommendations. One, amend the directive to address stops when the underlying reason for the stop has dissipated. So if an individual will stop and the officers hear over their radio that the person that they're looking for has already been discovered, the person should be released immediately. Second, amend the directive to document a specific process for releasing individuals not positively identified. Since that language isn't currently contained in the directives, there are over 6,000 officers at the Philadelphia Police Department. If we survey them, it's possible for us to receive 6,000 different ways for how to release someone. Some people may think that they released them on the scene. Some individuals may think, well, we have to process them at a station and then release them. So right now there is not contained within their directives to process. And third is to amend the directive to reflect the holding of Hicks as it relates to reasonable suspicion. And the Philadelphia Police Department has agreed to all three of these recommendations. And so the next step for these stops is to review the draft amendments to these directives and also share them with the community once they have been finalized. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the third level of interaction is a frisk, and the frisk is a pat down for weapons. And to conduct this frisk, an officer must have reasonable suspicion that the person that they have stopped is armed and dangerous. So this is the third level. Can you go to the next slide, Danny? So the PPD's existing policy for conducting frisks, which is stated here, the PAC found that this policy is actually consistent with existing standards. So because we did not locate any new standards, the PAC did not offer any recommendations at this time for how the Philadelphia Police Department can update this issue. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the last level is a search or an arrest of individuals. And this is the highest level and the most intrusive. Officers must have probable cause that an individual committed a crime. Can you go to the next one, Dan? Thank you. So, and this is related to Directive 12.8, which is stated here. And this area of the law actually changes very frequently as it relates to the search of vehicles. So it changes so drastically and frequently that in fact, the time between the PAC's release of this report to the Philadelphia Police Department and their review of the report, there was a huge case that changed everything as it relates to the search of vehicles. So originally, this policy stated that police must conduct a search of vehicles without a warrant if there is probable cause that contraband is concealed in the vehicle. Can you go to the next slide, please? So now the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has held that the warrantless searches require both probable cause and exigent circumstances, which is huge. It changes a lot of things. And I know what many of you all are thinking, well, what is considered exigent? Unfortunately, the court did not define that. But what the court did say, however, is, could you go to the next one, please, Danny? The court says here, I just took a little screen grab from the case, is that obtaining a warrant is the default rule. If there is no warrant, an officer has to justify why obtaining a warrant was not reasonably practical. So in this case, Commonwealth versus Alexander, Philadelphia police officers stopped the car, stated that they smelled the odor of marijuana, and then they searched the vehicle to locate the source of the marijuana without first obtaining a warrant. So this case changes a lot. So, oh yeah, thanks, Danny. You can go to the next one. So the next steps from this case is PPD has already released a training bulletin related to the Alexander case. And the PAC will discuss with the Philadelphia Police Department codifying this in a directive and creating a process for it. And the reason why the directives are so important is because it serves multiple purposes. It allows the public to see what officers have been trained to do, and it creates rules for how the Philadelphia Police Department will operate and hold their officers accountable when they fail to comply with these standards. So the PAC looks forward to reviewing the new drafts of these directives. And lastly, if your vehicle was searched without a warrant and you believe this policy was violated, please contact the PAC. Does anyone have questions?
We already have two questions from the chat, Angelica. The first is it also, we got what a great job. This is so informative. So you're off. Someone asked, is it possible that the reduction of stop and frisk means that police just mere encounter people more than more formally stop them less?
Yes, I've actually seen this across other departments where it's mentioned in their training protocols as well. Where, you know, since we have Terry that happened and the New York rise of stop and frisk, a lot of advocates and policymakers have really been trying to get a hold on stop and frisk. And now we're at a stage where if the issue is the stop, how are the departments going to be able to create something where, you know, they don't need reasonable suspicion to engage with individuals, and that's called a consensual encounter. But that is discretionary. It's to an officer's discretion. And what the PAC is concerned of is once you have this area of discretion, we want to make sure that there is a policy in place so things aren't abused. So that discretion is not abused. So we know that there are positive, you know, things from mere encounters, like they get tips to crimes, you know, they can build the community relations, but then we also want to make sure that is also not abused as well.
The next question we have is, when an officer realizes that the person they have stopped is not the person who committed the crime and should be released, should the officer still document the person's identification on a report?
So that is a great question. So since the policy hasn't been written yet, you know, after they replied to our report, they said they would draft this policy. So according to the case of the Bay case, the federal case, you know, if you have stopped someone and the victim has come by and stated that this person is not the individual, reasonable suspicion has now been erased. The individual, there is no longer any reasonable suspicion to hold this person further. So what the officer could do is then drop down a level to a mere encounter and say, well, you have not been identified, you're free to go. But they could ask for identification. And at that time, it will then go into, this is a consensual encounter. The person doesn't have to give the identification. But as it relates to the Bay case, I believe that once an officer knows that the person that they've stopped is not the person, they should be released immediately. But some things that can be recorded is like things like aggregate data. So they could say that at this time we stopped individual between the age of this and that, and there were this race, and be able to document that information.
There's a question that's more probably for Anthony, which is, why doesn't the police commissioner reply to PAC reports anymore? Isn't she supposed to be the person who replies?
Well, the police department responds to PAC reports still, and they provide written replies. So, I mean, I don't know what specifically is there any follow up to it, or was that?
You know, I guess it was just a question because this report has a response that's not from Commissioner.
Oh, they mean the signing.
Yeah,
that it's signed by Inspector Healy. Yeah, that's been the case the last few reports. Specifically, I don't know the answer as to why that changed. I think that it was just that the reports, or that the responses are authored by Inspector Healy, and you know, after approval from the commissioner. So since he was the author, I think maybe that's why they wanted him to sign the report. But it's a document that is from the police department and is their official response with the knowledge and consent of the commissioner.
Sean, I have your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you.
First of all, I just want to say that was an amazing report, an excellent detailed alternate report. Used to be a attorney, by the way, because
He is.
I am an attorney. I was a public defender for 4 years before I joined the PAC.
why did I never know that? So, okay. So, based on your report, have you ever thought about also giving your report to state Congress so that they can also implement this all over the state as well, like
Well,
for good
what we
cause.
hope for, Sean, is that all law enforcement agencies usually have, you know, their own attorneys. They have the law department looking at these cases and advising them. And what the PAC just wants is to make sure that when these cases come out, the Philadelphia Police Department is aware of them as soon as possible. Because if we're waiting until, you know, someone is arrested and charged and changes happens through the criminal justice system, there could be thousands of people who are impacted who may not end up in the criminal justice system because of these cases. You know, there are people who are stopped and they aren't arrested and they're impacted by these cases. So we just want to make sure that I'm sure, you know, all law department agencies within the state and nationally are aware of new cases that come out within their states. But this is just an area where we know that, you know, with the new home rule charter and also with other review of stop and frisk information, we just saw this as an opportunity to inform the police department that there are some cases here that many of them haven't been discussed before. And we just wanted to make sure we brought it to their attention.
Another question from the chat from Marnie was, if a person is stopped mistakenly, then why should that person go into a police report?
If the person is
stopped mistakenly, then why should that go into the police report?
Well, that's very helpful for, I mean, even as a prior public defender, if I'm representing a person and the argument is that, you know, they have my client, it could be helpful for an individual if they learn that officers stopped maybe 20 or 30 people as it relates to this. And so, you know, this is just more information. It could be considered what's called Brady information, where, you know, there's information that is relevant to the criminal case that the officers have to provide. But if someone has already been stopped and they have not been identified and the officers don't know their identification, then according to the case, it is reasonable to say that the person should be released immediately.
Someone asked, what is the national hit rate for stop and frisk search?
Oh, I'm not sure. Sorry, I don't have that.
I don't know off the top of my head.
We can.
Danny, we have questions from Bibi and Bilal.
Yep, I was just about to.
I should have known you were on it. Sorry.
He never misses.
Bilal,
Nope.
you ready? I'm unmuting you, Bilal.
Yeah, quick question. The last point about the stop, and you use the example about a lot of times people get stopped for police stop, they maybe smell marijuana, and that we're still talking to the police department, the PAC, about how we're going to deal with that issue. Am I right on that?
Well, yeah, so that case was actually listed in the report, the one that you're referring to about the odor of marijuana. So after that case, it was just months later, the Alexander case came. And Alexander really trumps the other case because the marijuana case was just on marijuana, but Alexander is for all car searches in general. And so if you look at the report that the Philadelphia Police Department returned to us, like in their response, they said that they are familiar with the case and they're writing a training bulletin now on how they can, you know, comply with the standards of that case. And so I'm not sure what they're going to come up with, but, you know, once they get to that level, we're going to review their draft and want to make sure we share it with the public once we know what their operating procedures are going to be. Okay,
the reason I raised that point is that a lot of young folks now smoke marijuana, but they call it loud. Loud is marijuana with a whole bunch of other crap in it. And that's the best way I can explain it. So the difference is the smell. It almost smells like, my wife refers to it like a skunk. So if you could be smoking loud and I'll be with you, I'm not smoking, that smell goes into my clothes. And it can last for a while now. So I could be driving home, didn't smoke nothing, but I was with you and you were smoking it loud, so now it's in my clothes. So I'm raising that as a point as we have the discussion with the police. Things have changed now than the normal kind of way when we deal with the issue about marijuana. And I think that we need to be, well, we have to wait like you said, for them to come up with there might be policy, but we have to have a discussion, I think, with them as we go along what their policy is, because a lot of folks could be stopped by smell. But that person, once again, did not participate in smoking. But because of the drug down today, is different, and a person could be stopped, you know, the officer could say, "Look, I'm justified stopped because I smelled the stuff," but that person, once again, did not smoke. So it's going to be kind of complicated. But I think we have that discussion with them.
Right. I think all of these, you know, changes in the law is going to be complicated as far as interpreting it. And just like the little, you know, lawyer light inside of me, it's just disclaimer. This is not legal advice. This is just reviewing the cases and saying, hey, Philadelphia Police Department, these are cases you should be aware of, and you should amend your directives as it relates to these cases.
Bibi, I think, had a question next. Bibi, I'm going to unmute you.
Is that, I'm good. Yep. Comment is, I have a comment and a question. My comment is, if marijuana is legalized, that will be a whole new world too, that you'll have to re-review. But my question is very specific. When you describe the cost case, I think I heard you say the police department does not agree. What is the position of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office vis-a-vis the cost case?
I am not sure. What we plan on doing was talking to the Philadelphia Police Department again about the cost case. And if they disagree with our interpretation, then to maybe at that time to, you know, address it with the District Attorney's Office, or address it with the law department, or any other, you know, legal experts that are out there to get them to weigh in on this. But the cost case is, you know, to the PAC's view, of a very serious case, because there are a lot of individuals who, you know, a lot of individuals think that the stop rate is going down. But then when you talk to the community members, when we review complaints against police, we're actually seeing that people are thinking that they're, you know, the stop level is the same. And they could be referring to the same thing, but using different words. Like the Philadelphia Police Department could be referring to these as mere encounters, but the public, the general public, still thinks that they're stops. And so what we want to do is create some type of transparency there. Even though they disagree with us, that's still not going to stop us from trying to push for these recommendations.
Thank you.
And we've requested a meeting about that in the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
George looks like he has a question. George, I'm unmuting you.
Yep, so I've been an attorney for 33 years, and I've never heard anyone explain the efficacy of police action at the different stages of police encounters better than Angelica did.
Thank you.
I however, have a comment, and Angelica, you may want to respond, or others may want to respond. In the current context that we live in, especially in the city of Philadelphia, where we're experiencing record numbers of shootings, record numbers of homicides, I think it's important for the public to note that the PAC is not advocating for the abolishment of stop and frisk, which is the way that this conversation is sometimes couched. What you did today, I believe, evidences a desire to have the police do it right. But stop and frisk is not going away.
Well, stop and frisk are really, you know, just from my report, you know, it's been around for decades, and stop and frisk is just a certain aspect to the levels of encounters that police can have with individuals. And so it's similar to the Home Rule Charter. The PAC wants to make sure that if there is a stop conducted, it's done based on, you know, articulated facts of that, you know, that can rise to the level of reasonable suspicion that someone is engaged in a crime. And just the same way as a frisk, you know, we actually reviewed the frisk, and the PAC did not believe that there were any other additional amendments that could be had as it relates to frisk. And so what we want to make sure of is that, you know, the public is aware of what's going on, that police officers are adequately trained, Because once we can, heighten both of those levels, then we can get to the level where individuals are understanding what's going on. And then the police officers can also as well, give a bit more courtesy and have more understanding of the law and the new, areas of the law. Because what's dangerous is if we get to the level where these pedestrian investigations are not updated within, sometimes I've seen in other departments, it takes a long time for this update to happen. And while they're waiting for the update, people are being harmed. People feel like their rights are being infringed upon. So the sooner that we can, bring this to the Philadelphia Police Department's attention, we are hopeful that people can believe that the Philadelphia Police Department knows of their rights and will respect them.
I had another question that said documenting suspect info can also be useful in flagging officers who repeatedly stop the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Right, that's exactly right. And that's why we're asking, for that information and also for, for an audit process to happen as well. It's to the level where if an individual does have a mirror encounter, why is an officer electing to have this mirror encounter with this specific person? And even as it relates to the stops, if you're stopping the wrong person, then maybe this can be translated into something where we can look at reforms to the police dispatch. Like, is it something where more information needs to be relayed over the radio before we just go to black male 6'1", 160 pounds?
Awesome. I think those are all my last questions in the chat, unless anybody else, anything else?
Thanks, Angelica. That was perfect.
Thank you.
Really a fine job. Thank you. Should we go into public comment, which I guess is not a whole lot different from what we've been doing, but if folks have questions that were unrelated to, that are unrelated to Angelica's report or the CPOC legislation, here's your moment. Tell us what you're thinking.
I don't see any questions in the chat. It doesn't look like any hands are raised.
Okay. Well, then perhaps we'll end a bit early. As always, I want to thank you all for joining us. It's almost all of the participants stayed throughout the entire hour and a half. And I think that says a lot about their commitment to civic engagement. And so we appreciate that. Before we go, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Bilal, looks like.
All in favor? Aye. Our next meeting is Monday, March 15th. The link is in the agenda, but Danny and his ever completely competent on top of everything way, make sure that goes out several more times. So
I just put in the chat, if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up. You can do so on our website, just following that link that I just put in. And I send out monthly reminders for the meetings, and I'll send a reminder tomorrow as well, which will have the link as well as the video from tonight if anybody missed part of it.
He's on it, see?
He sure is.
That's right. Well, I want to thank you all. Have a good night. Take care. Stay safe. We'll see you next month.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.